I gotta admit, I wasn't surprised. For a while there, it seemed very plausible that No Time to Die could actually get released by Thanksgiving, giving movie theaters that ever so slight glimpse of hope that they could survive this whole crisis. But nope, the producers announced the film's second COVID-caused delay, in which it is now set to be released on April 2nd, 2021, practically an entire year after it was originally supposed to release. Despite the obvious disappointment I feel from this delay, especially since I've been doing this James Bond review marathon in anticipation of that November release date, that doesn't mean I've given up on Bond just yet. His next movie may still be months away from an actual release, yet my heart is still set on completing these videos as I had originally intended. So with that, I appreciate the time you've already spent listening to me discuss the adventures of everyone's favorite MI6 operative since May, and for those who will be sticking around for these final videos, I appreciate you even more. Welcome back to the James Bond movie review marathon. Last month when I talked about Timothy Dalton, I shared how I really loved this actor's approach to the character. While I would call The Living Daylights his only surefire hit between the two films he made, there's no denying that he cared about depicting James Bond as Ian Fleming envisioned him to be. Nothing about Timothy Dalton's approach was outright goofy or nonsensical, for he embodied a cold-hearted killer that just happened to say funny lines and otherwise get in bed with women on occasion. Now, Timothy Dalton had every intention of returning for another film, for his contract was set for 3 productions. However, in the early 1990s, a number of vicious legal disputes put the production of the next movie on hold. In short words, there was a massive debate going on between distributor MGM/United Artists and the longtime owners of the James Bond license, mostly about, you guessed it, money. Think the obnoxious Sony-Disney dispute over Spider-Man last year, except instead of working out a deal quickly like those two companies, the messy deals for James Bond languished from 1990 to 1993. By the time all of the legal scuffles were over and done with, Timothy Dalton's contract had automatically expired. But as a result, we got a very memorable set of performances from another talented actor, Pierce Brosnan. Famously, Brosnan was the first actor to not be from the UK, instead hailing from Ireland. But his heritage had no bearing on his ability to pull off the role, because whereas Timothy Dalton had a chip on his shoulder, Brosnan had that and an acute sense of smoothness. He really feels as though he's an attractive gentleman in the same way that Sean Connery was, while at the same time bearing the ferocity of a focused assassin. That second element is something I wish to focus on, because the context behind Brosnan's Bond is partly what makes him so interesting. I mean, the critical element is the performance, of course, but as we saw with Roger Moore, characterization on the page is just as important. James Bond, as originally envisioned by Ian Fleming, was a character conceived with a post-war frame of mind. That certainly factored into the Connery era, but as the films were produced into the 70s and 80s, elements of the Cold War worked their way into the character's public image. But then, the Berlin Wall fell right around the same time that License to Kill was released, and subsequently the political climate in the world began to shift. James Bond was thought of as a fading relic of the past, one whose identity would be firmly stuck in that prior period of history. But as we see in Pierce Brosnan's very good first outing Goldeneye, the writers and producers found a subtle way to make it work. The film's prologue, funny enough, takes place in 1986 while the Soviet Union is still intact. It's a tight, suspenseful, and fun introduction to the intense portrayal of Brosnan's take on the character, while we also get a taste of Sean Bean's work as top-tier Bond villain Alec Trevelyan. More impactful than this opening, however, is what is seen once we get into the meat of the story. For one thing, Judi Dench filled the role of M in a groundbreaking casting choice, being the first woman to portray a character of this capacity in the franchise. The stark dichotomy between herself and the very lived-in, nihilistic Bond brings about a more fascinating character dynamic. M used to be just the guy who gives Bond orders, but now, she's a force in his life that has to rein in on his collateral damage. Bond's the one who makes the mess, and you really come to understand that M has to clean up said mess. You would think that this would result in James Bond becoming very unlikable, but he remains a compelling protagonist in Goldeneye because Brosnan honors the cold, misogynistic nature of the character, while juxtaposing those attributes by making Bond's spy work very convincing. His Bond may not exactly be the most fun person to have at a party, but because of his physical abilities, sense of humor, and skills at espionage, he's fun to watch at least. The movie itself is also quite entertaining. Not that it has a powerful story to tell, but for all the elements I've already mentioned, on top of some truly breakneck action sequences that are more white-knuckled and visceral than any other Bond movie before it, Goldeneye stands high among my current ranking of this whole franchise. The unfortunate thing though, is that I can't quite say the same thing about the other 3 films Pierce Brosnan participated in thereafter. Remember when I said that Pierce Brosnan's Bond was the result of the producers trying to make the character relevant in a changing world? Well, I feel like Goldeneye was evidence that the creative team really tried to make a great first impression with Pierce Brosnan, and then they fell back into predictable old habits. Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough are certainly decent movies, and compared to some of the other Drek in this series, they could have been far worse. Pierce Brosnan still delivered convincing performances in these films, and everything about their respective productions were still professional, maintaining a sense of large-scale fun in some of the action scenes and having coherent plots. However, nothing in these movies stick out quite like how they did in Goldeneye. That film was trying to go the extra mile with its story, whereas with its 2 immediate sequels, the material is much more generic and standard, featuring less interesting villains and wasting the audience's time with boring, unnecessary filler. Things became even worse once Die Another Day released in 2002, which was just an embarrassment of a movie. It starts out decently enough with that opening action sequence in the North Korean military base, but it quickly dissolves into a bunch of discordant nonsense, choosing to play things closer to a live-action imitation of a cartoon. This feels even more apparent with the fact that the filmmakers were sometimes over-reliant on bad CGI, like with that stupid sun laser beam thing. You can't fault the filmmakers for casting Halle Berry as a Bond girl though, but let's just say that out of all the times she hilariously tried to prove herself as an action star in the 2000s, she never really got the chance to until John Wick Chapter 3 last year. With all this being said, the Pierce Brosnan era for James Bond is intriguing because although he himself embodied the role magnificently, the same can't be said about the films he took part in. Things began strong, but quickly lost the good thing they had going for them by not harnessing the good qualities that made GoldenEye special. Oh well, at least Brosnan's era was a bit more consistent than those of his predecessors, and I think only one of his films could really be considered bad. It easily could have been a lot worse. On that note, thank you for chiming in to hear my thoughts on the Pierce Brosnan era of this franchise. We look forward to the 4 films starring Daniel Craig that have been released thus far, and as such, please make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on that video when it comes out next month. I'm still promising another surprise James Bond video to be due by next month as well. This is Zach Kircher, signing out.